There are places in the mountains of Veracruz where land has a price. And sometimes that price isn't paid with money. It's paid with souls. There are ranches that look like paradise. Green, fertile, full of life. The coffee plantation smells like promise. The river sounds peaceful. But if you approach the ranch called El Sacrificio, the sacrifice, if you look beyond the flowers and the cattle, if you dare to meet the gaze of Leticia's daughters, you will see that paradise is a cage, and that the only sacrifice offered there, day after day, is innocence. I am Mateo del Valle, and this is Forbidden Reality. The story you are about to hear is a lump in your throat. It is the chronicle of a pact whispered in the dark. The story of a mother who, to save a piece of land, sold the future of her 4 daughters to the same man. A monster dressed as a benefactor. Before continuing, I ask you to subscribe, to activate that bell, not to add to a number, but so that the voices of these girls, drowned by tradition and fear, may find an echo, so that their story is not swallowed up by the earth, like so many other secrets of the mountains. Let's begin this painful journey. Javier was a teacher. He was 24 years old and had a vocation as great as his naivety. He had asked to be sent to the most remote place, where he felt he could really make a difference. The system listened to him. It sent him to a small community in the mountains of Veracruz, a handful of houses lost in the fog. The school was a single room with a tin roof. There were few children. They were shy, with old eyes and hands accustomed to hard work. Among them were the Mendez sisters, Margarita, Dalia, and Azucena. They were beautiful, like wildflowers. But there was something strange about them. They never spoke. Ever. Not to each other. Not to the other children. Not to him. They sat together in a corner. They moved together. They breathed together, as if they were one person with 3 bodies. Their homework was always impeccable. Their handwriting was perfect. But their eyes were empty, dull, like deep wells where no light could reach. Javier tried to get closer. He asked them direct questions. They just nodded or shook their heads. Once, he asked Azucena, the youngest, barely 8 years old, what she wanted to be when she grew up. The girl looked at him, and for a moment, Javier saw a flash of pure panic. Then she looked down at her notebook and didn't look up again for the rest of the day. There was a 4th sister, Rosa, the oldest. She was 16. She no longer went to school. Sometimes Javier saw her in the distance, walking along the path that led to her family's ranch. She walked with her shoulders slumped, dragging her feet, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her back. The ranch was called El Sacrificio, the sacrifice. A strange name? Ominous. It was the most prosperous ranch in the area. It belonged to Leticia, the girl's mother, a widow. But everyone in town knew that the real owner was someone else. Don Arnulfo, an old man. Rich, powerful, the local boss. Don Arnulfo lived on the ranch with Leticia and her daughters. The town whispered. They said he had helped them when Leticia's husband died, that he was their protector. But they said it quietly, with a sidelong glance, with the fear one has of demons walking among us. Javier felt that something was deeply wrong. The oppression in that town was palpable. You could feel it in the humid air. One day, little Azucena arrived at school with a purple mark on her arm, a bruise in the shape of fingers that had gripped her too tightly. Javier knelt down in front of her. "Azucena, who did this to you?" he asked in a low voice. The girl cringed. She began to tremble. Her sisters, Margarita and Dahlia, stood up instantly. They stood beside her like two little soldiers. Their looks were not fearful. They were warning, a warning directed at him. That afternoon, Javier decided he could no longer ignore it. When classes ended, he followed the girls. At a safe distance, he watched them walk down the sidewalk silently, in single file. They arrived at the ranch called El Sacrificio. Javier hid among the coffee trees surrounding the main house. His heart was beating wildly. He knew he was crossing a dangerous line. But the image of the bruise on Azucena's arm drove him on. From his hiding place, Javier watched life on the ranch. It was a macabre choreography. He saw Leticia, the mother, come out onto the terrace. Her face was a mask of harshness. She shouted an order, and the three girls coming home from school, instead of going inside to play or rest, set to work. One swept the yard, another fed the pigs. Azucena, the youngest, carried buckets of water from the well. Buckets that were almost bigger than she was. Javier looked for the older sister, Rosa. He found her in the kitchen. He could see her through an open window. She was cooking, moving with the slowness of an automaton. Her face was swollen, as if she had been crying for hours. Then he appeared. Don Arnulfo. He came out onto the terrace. He sat down in a large wicker chair, like a king on his throne. He was a burly man, about 60 years old. He had a heavy, oily gaze. He called Margarita. The 12-year-old girl put down the broom and approached him with her head bowed. "The boots," he said. Margarita knelt down and began to clean the mud off his leather boots, with a rag, with her own hands. Leticia, her mother, watched the scene from the doorway. Her arms crossed. Her expression was indecipherable. Neither love nor hate. Just empty acceptance. Javier felt the air escape from his lungs. Sweat ran down his back, cold sweat. The taste of bile rose in his throat. This was not a family. It was a fiefdom. And they were the servants. Evening fell. Fog began to descend from the mountains, enveloping the ranch in a ghostly veil. The door to the house closed. But Javier did not move. He waited. He didn't know what he hoped to find, but he knew he had to stay. A few hours later, a light came on in one of the rooms on the second floor, the master bedroom. Don Arnulfo's room. The curtain wasn't closed properly. There was a small gap. Javier, trembling, raised the binoculars he always carried for bird watching. He focused. What he saw broke him. He saw Don Arnulfo sitting on the bed, in his dressing gown, and standing in front of him was Rosa, the older sister. She was wearing a white nightgown. A nightgown that was too childish for a 16-year-old girl. Don Arnulfo was saying something to her. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the movement of his mouth. It was an order. Rosa didn't move. She shook her head. Silent tears ran down her cheeks. Don Arnulfo stood up. He slapped her. The force of the blow knocked Rosa to the floor. Javier stifled a cry. He wanted to run, to scream, to break down the door. But he was paralyzed by horror. The bedroom door opened, and Leticia, the mother, entered. She didn't look at Don Arnulfo. She looked at her daughter lying on the floor. She approached her. She lifted her up by the arm. With brutal force, Javier could read her lips. The words she whispered to her own daughter. "Do it, or we won't eat tomorrow. Do it, for your sisters. It's your duty." And then Leticia left the room. She closed the door, leaving her eldest daughter alone with the monster. Javier lowered his binoculars. He vomited. He vomited silently among the coffee trees. His body shook in uncontrollable spasms. The cold had penetrated his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain night. It was the cold of absolute evil, the cold of a mother sacrificing her daughter. He fled from there. He ran down the path, stumbling in the darkness. He didn't stop until he reached his small teacher's house. He locked himself in, and he trembled all night long. The image repeated itself in his head over and over again. The slap, the fall, the mother's empty gaze, the words, "It's your duty." He understood the name of the ranch, the sacrifice. But it wasn't a sacrifice to God. It was a sacrifice to the devil. And the altar was a monster's bed, and the offering was his own daughters. The story of the ranch. The sacrifice was an open wound that everyone in the village pretended not to see. Letitia's husband, a good man, but a poor manager, had died of a heart attack 5 years ago. He had left her alone, with 4 daughters, and a debt to Don Arnulfo that was impossible to pay. A debt for seeds, for fertilizer, for a loan to fix the roof. Don Arnulfo owned the village store, the only truck, and the will of the men. One day, he showed up at the ranch. Leticia thought he was going to kick them out, to take away the only thing they had. But Don Arnulfo made her another offer. He would forgive the debt. He would give her money every month, food, clothes. He would protect the ranch. In exchange for one thing. One of her daughters, the eldest, Rosa, she was only 14 years old. "She will be like my daughter," he said with his oily smile. "I will take care of her. I will teach her to be a woman. And when the time comes, she will be my wife, the mistress of all this." Leticia felt the world stop. She looked around her. She looked at the land her grandparents had worked. She looked at her other 3 daughters playing in the yard, and she made a decision. Or rather, she convinced herself that she had no other choice. It was the land or her daughters on the street, begging. It was the sacrifice of one for the survival of all. That night, she prepared Rosa. She washed her hair. She put on her best dress. "Starting today, you will serve Don Arnulfo," she said, without looking her in the eyes. "It's for our own good, for the ranch." Rosa cried. She begged. But her mother had turned to stone. The pact was sealed. What began with Rosa soon became routine. When Margarita turned 12, Don Arnulfo claimed her. "So she can learn to serve in the house," he told Leticia. And then Dahlia, and little Azucena was already in his sights. Don Arnulfo didn't see them as girls. He saw them as his property, his private harem. And Leticia became the guardian of that prison, the overseer. Her heart, if she ever had one, dried up. Love was replaced by a brutal logic of survival. For the ranch to live, her daughters had to die a little every day. This was the weight Javier carried in his soul. This was the horror that drove him down from the mountains, to seek help, to believe foolishly that the law would protect him, that the world would put an end to this nightmare. He was about to discover that there are monsters worse than Don Arnulfo, monsters who wear uniforms, who sit behind desks, and who can kill hope with a simple shrug of their shoulders. Javier arrived at the municipal capital, a larger town with a square, a church, and a faded town hall. The police station was on the ground floor. It smelled of damp and cheap cigarettes. A policeman with a huge belly was dozing in a plastic chair, a gossip magazine on his chest. Javier had to clear his throat twice before he opened his eyes. "What do you want, maestro?" said the policeman, his voice slurred from interrupted sleep. Javier, his voice trembling with indignation, told him everything. The ranch, Don Arnulfo, the girls, the slap, the mother's words. The policeman listened without moving. His face showed no surprise, no horror, only boredom. When Javier finished, the policeman stretched, yawning, a long, loud yawn. "Look, kid," he said, in a tone that was a mixture of pity and warning. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, but that doesn't—" "It does," interrupted the policeman. "It has everything to do with it. That ranch belongs to Don Arnulfo, and Don Arnulfo is Don Arnulfo. He's the law in those mountains, you understand?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They're his women. Their mother agrees. They live well. They eat every day. Better than you and me. It's an arrangement. That's the way things have always been around here." Javier couldn't believe it. "They're girls. It's a crime. You have to do something," he exclaimed. The policeman laughed dryly. "Do what? Go to his ranch and arrest him? With what men? With what order? With what evidence?" "With your word. A teacher from Mexico City who just got here?" He leaned back in his chair. "Don't get involved, teacher. You didn't see anything. You didn't hear anything. Stick to teaching the kids their ABCs and be thankful you have a job. And don't bother me again with these stories." He put the magazine over his face, ending the conversation. Javier stood in the middle of the smelly office. The buzzing of a fly was the only sound. He felt a wave of impotent rage rise from his feet. He wanted to scream, to hit something. But all he felt was a deep coldness, the coldness of complicity, of calculated indifference. He left. The midday sun beat down on him, but it couldn't take away the coldness in his bones. He didn't give up. If the local law was complicit, he would go to the capital. He took a bus to Jalapa, 3 hours of winding roads and landscapes that now seemed sinister to him. He looked for the state attorney general's office. A large modern building made of glass and steel. Here, he thought, it would be different. Here, the law was the law. He waited 2 hours in an impersonal waiting room. Finally, he was received by an agent from the public prosecutor's office, a young woman in a suit with a perpetually overworked expression. Javier recounted his story. This time, he tried to be more objective, less emotional, just presenting the facts. The agent listened as she typed rapidly on her computer, not looking at him. When he finished, she paused. She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were tired. "Young man." She began with a sigh. "Do you have any proof of what you're saying? Photos? Videos? A statement signed by one of the victims or their mother?" "No, just what I saw. But if you talk to the girls alone—" "It doesn't work like that." She cut him off, with a patience that sounded like an insult. "We can't just go. We need a formal complaint to open an investigation. You say you saw Slap. He'll say he was disciplining his stepdaughter. The mother will back him up. And the girls, from what you tell me, aren't going to talk. It's your word against that of an influential man. Politically, it's a very weak case." The logic was so cold, so perfect, that Javier felt nauseous. "Look," the agent continued, "legally, those girls are in their mother's custody. What you're describing is a very complex family matter, typical of the customs and traditions of some rural areas." The words customs and traditions sounded like a death sentence. "If you want to proceed, Fill out this form for possible domestic violence, the 4C. Be very detailed. But I warn you, without further evidence, it is very likely that the case will be closed due to lack of evidence. She slid a stack of papers through the window. The system was not seeking justice. It was seeking to organize horror into folders, to classify it, assign it a file number, file it away until it was forgotten. Javier took the papers. They weighed like lead. The air conditioning in the prosecutor's office chilled his skin. He left the glass building that looked like a tomb. He sat down on a bench in the street. He looked at the forms. Absurd questions. Blank spaces that no words could fill. He felt completely alone, defeated. The system was not designed to help the girls at the El Sacrificio ranch. It was designed to protect men like Don Arnulfo, to perpetuate silence. For the first time in his life, Javier understood what true despair was. Weeks passed. Javier returned to the mountains. He tried to fill out the forms, but every word felt useless. At school, the atmosphere was even heavier. The Mendez sisters barely looked up. Javier knew that Don Arnulfo had been alerted. The look on the town policeman's face had told him everything. He felt watched. A couple of times, a luxury SUV, which he knew belonged to Don Arnulfo, drove slowly past the school. It was a silent warning. Javier began to feel afraid, physically afraid. At night, he heard noises outside his house. He imagined Don Arnulfo's men waiting for him in the dark. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. Helplessness was consuming him. He was becoming one of the town's silent accomplices. One night, while grading notebooks by the light of a kerosene lamp, he collapsed. He rested his head on the table and cried. He cried out of anger, out of fear, out of frustration. That was when he made a final, desperate decision. If the system wouldn't listen, he would make the whole country listen. He remembered an old friend from college who now worked as an investigative journalist for a national news website. One of those brave media outlets that wasn't afraid of the powerful. He used what little credit he had left on his cell phone to call him. He told him everything. His voice was breaking. The journalist on the other end of the line listened in silence. When Javier finished, there was only one question. Can you get out of there tonight? The story broke 2 days later. The headline was brutal. The harem of the Sierra, the mother who sold her 4 daughters to the Veracruz Wagners. The report included Javier's anonymous testimony. The names had been changed, but the details were so precise that there was no doubt who they were talking about. The article was shared thousands of times. The scandal made national news. What the local police and the state prosecutor's office had ignored, media pressure turned into a time bomb. The Veracruz governor's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Suddenly, the case became a state priority. A massive operation was organized in a matter of hours. State police, National Guard, agents from the prosecutor's office specializing in crimes against women. A convoy of trucks and patrol cars drove up into the mountains. They arrived at the El Sacrificio ranch at dawn. The rescue was televised chaos. Don Arnulfo was arrested. He left the house with arrogant calm, as if it were all an annoying misunderstanding. Leticia, the mother, reacted with savage fury. "Leave him alone," she shouted at the police. "He is our benefactor. He saved us. You have come to destroy our family." But the most heartbreaking scene was that of the girls. They didn't run to hug their rescuers. They clung to their mother's legs. They cried in terror. Margarita, Dalia, and little Azucena screamed that they didn't want to leave. that this was their home. Rosa, the oldest, simply stood in a corner with the same empty look, as if none of this were real, as if their bodies were there, but their souls had left long ago. The cameras filmed everything. Politicians gave statements. They spoke of a successful operation and zero tolerance for gender violence. No one mentioned the weeks of silence, the closed door of the police station, the useless forms from the prosecutor's office. The system, which had been complicit by omission, was now awarding itself the Hero's Medal. The story did not have a happy ending, because in the forbidden reality, such endings almost never exist. Don Arnulfo, with his expensive lawyers and connections, managed to prolong the trial. He spent only a few months in preventive detention before being placed under house arrest for health problems. Letitia was charged with corruption of minors and omission. She was sentenced to a short prison term. In her statements, she never showed any remorse. I did what I had to do to save my land, so that my daughters would have a roof over their heads. The girls were the real final sacrifice. They were placed in the DIF system, separated, sent to different shelters for their protection. Their trauma was so deep that they didn't know how to function in the outside world. They were afraid of men, of teachers, of noise, of freedom. Rosa, the oldest, tried to take her own life twice. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Her diagnosis, a broken soul. The other three struggle every day to rebuild the pieces of a childhood that was stolen from them. Javier, the teacher, had to leave the village. He received death threats. Today he teaches at a school on the outskirts of a big city. Sometimes, at night, he still dreams of his students' empty stares. The ranch El Sacrificio is abandoned. The grass has grown tall. The windows are broken. The land, that land for which such a high price was paid, now belongs to no one. It is just a silent monument to failure. To the failure of a mother, of a community, and of a system that only acts when the cameras are watching. I'm Mateo Del Valle, and I'll see you in the next Realidad Prohibida.